Because that is exactly what happened to an entire nation. Not one family, not one village. An entire nation of 33 million people woke up one morning and discovered that the story they had been telling themselves for 500 years was, at best, only half true. And the other half? The other half was buried so deep, in such a hidden place, that it took the most advanced technology on Earth to finally pull it back into the light. This is the story of Peru, and I promise you, by the end of what I am about to tell you, you will never look at this country the same way again. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, and I mean truly uncomfortable. Because Peru is one of those places where the official story and the genetic story are not just different. They are almost opposites. The official story says Spanish conquerors came, they mixed with the native people, they built a new civilization, and the result is the modern Peruvian. Clean, simple, a little painful, but understandable. A story of collision and fusion, the kind of story that fits neatly into a school textbook. But the genetic story, the one written not in ink but in adenine and guanine and cytosine, in the letters of the oldest alphabet that has ever existed, that story says something far more complicated, something far more ancient, and something that should make every single person on this planet stop and think about what we actually mean when we use the word identity. Let us go back. Not 500 years, not 1,000. Let us go back 15,000 years, because that is where the real story of Peru begins. Imagine the world at that time. Europe is covered in ice. The Middle East is barely a whisper of what it will become. And somewhere in northeastern Asia, a group of people, not a large group, maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, are standing at the edge of a land bridge that connects the continent they know to a continent they have never seen. They do not know what is on the other side. They only know they are moving. They are always moving. That is what humans do. And those people, those brave, freezing, impossible people, they walked across what is now the Bering Strait. They walked into the unknown. And then they kept walking. South. Always south. Through forests and mountains and rivers that had no names yet, because there was no one to name them. They walked for generations. Children were born on the road. Grandparents died on the road. And still they moved. Until one group of them, after thousands of years of southward movement, finally arrived at a place so breathtaking, so geographically dramatic, so biologically rich, that they stopped. They looked around at the mountains that touched the clouds, at the river systems that fed half a continent, at the coastline where cold Pacific currents pushed unbelievable amounts of fish toward the shore. And they decided, this is home. This place would one day be called Peru. But here is the first conflict, the first moment where the story cracks open and becomes something darker and more complicated than a simple migration tale. Because those first people, the ones scientists call the Paleo-Indians, they were not alone for long. Over the following millennia, wave after wave of new populations moved into South America, each wave carrying slightly different genetics, slightly different tools, slightly different ways of seeing the world. And each wave either absorbed the people before them or was absorbed by them. This is not a peaceful process. Do not let anyone tell you that ancient migration was just people wandering gently from one place to another. Migration is conflict. Migration is competition for food, for water, for the best land near the river, for the valleys that are warm in winter. Migration is war. Migration is love. Migration is the desperate biological drive of every living organism to survive and reproduce. And the Peruvian genetic record carries all of that. Every conflict, every alliance, every moment when two groups of people looked at each other across a valley and had to decide, do we fight or do we merge? Now science has a word for what happened in Peru over those thousands of years before any European ever set foot on the continent. The word is diversification, and what it means in practical terms is this. The people who settled Peru were not one group. They were many groups, arriving at different times, from slightly different ancestral populations in Asia, each one adapting to a radically different environment. Because Peru is not one landscape. Peru is every landscape. The coastal desert, one of the driest places on Earth, where ancient cultures like the Corral civilization built the oldest cities in the Western Hemisphere, more than 4,000 years before a Spanish ship ever crossed the Atlantic. Then the Andes, the second highest mountain range on the planet, where the air is so thin that your body has to physically change over generations just to survive. Larger lung capacity, different hemoglobin density, a heart that beats differently than yours does right now. And then the Amazon, the jungle, the green darkness that covers more than half of Peru's territory and contains more species of life per square kilometer than almost anywhere else on Earth. 3 completely different worlds. 3 completely different sets of survival pressures. And the humans who lived in each of those worlds were shaped by them, genetically, in ways that are still visible today when scientists run the tests. And now comes the moment where science enters the story like a detective kicking down a door. Because when geneticists began collecting DNA samples from modern Peruvians, from people in Lima, from Quechua speakers in the highlands, from communities deep in the Amazon, from descendants of the old coastal cultures, they expected to find something relatively straightforward. They expected the genetic signature of the story everyone already knew. Some native Andean ancestry, some European ancestry from the Spanish colonial period, perhaps a small amount of African ancestry from the enslaved people brought to work the sugar plantations and silver mines. Expected, logical, proportional. The kind of result that confirms the textbook. But instead, what the data showed them was something that made the room go quiet. What the data showed them was that the indigenous component of Peruvian DNA was not a supporting character in this genetic story. It was not a layer beneath the European influence. It was the foundation, the bedrock, the thing that everything else was sitting on top of. In the highland communities, in the jungle communities, and even in the coastal urban centers where Spanish architecture and Catholic churches dominate the skyline, the ancient indigenous genetic signal was overwhelming. Not 50%, not 60%. In many tested populations, the native ancestral component reached above 80 and even 90% of the total genetic makeup. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 90%. 500 years of Spanish colonization. 500 years of a language being replaced, of a religion being imposed, of names being changed, and histories being rewritten, and children being taught that their ancestors were primitive. 500 years of one of the most aggressive cultural transformation projects in human history. And yet the blood said no. The blood held on. The blood remembered. This is what scientists call the paradox of elite dominance, the phenomenon where a conquering group can replace a language, replace a religion, replace a political system, can rename every mountain and every river and every city, and still barely scratch the surface of the genetic makeup of the people they claim to have transformed. The Spanish came. The Spanish conquered. The Spanish built cathedrals on top of temples, but they could not rewrite the human genome. They could not erase 15,000 years of ancestry with a sword and a Bible. And this is where the story takes another turn. Because if the indigenous ancestry is so dominant, if it survived colonization so completely at the biological level, then the question becomes, what exactly is that indigenous ancestry made of? Who were those first Peruvians really? And the answer, when you go deep enough into the haplogroup analysis, when you start reading the ancient letters of the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, the answer is a detective story inside a detective story. The male lineages, the Y chromosome haplogroups found in Peruvian indigenous populations, are overwhelmingly from a cluster called Q. Specifically, the branch scientists label QM3. And QM3 is one of the most powerful genetic fingerprints in the entire field of population genetics, because it exists almost exclusively in the Americas. It is the mark of the original migration. It is the genetic echo of those people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge 15,000 years ago and never looked back. When you find QM3 in a DNA sample, you are not looking at a recent migration. You are not looking at trade contact or colonial mixing. You are looking at the unbroken thread connecting a living human being to the very first Americans. That thread in Peru is astonishingly intact, astonishingly unbroken. And the scientific community, when they saw how clean and dominant that signal was in certain highland communities, genuinely had to stop and look at each other across the laboratory. Because what they were seeing was not just a statistic, it was a message written 15,000 years ago by people who had no idea that one day a machine would be able to read it. A message that said, "We were here. We have always been here. And no matter what happened above us, on the surface of history, in the loud, violent theater of conquest and colonization and cultural replacement, we never left." But now the story gets even more complicated. Because the genetic picture of Peru is not simply a story of one ancient population surviving intact. It is a story of multiple ancient populations, each one distinct, each one shaped by a radically different environment, each one carrying its own genetic fingerprint, all of them coexisting within the borders of a single modern nation. And when scientists began to compare the DNA of highland Quechua communities with the DNA of Amazonian tribal populations, and both of those with the ancient coastal populations, they found something that stopped the entire field of South American population genetics in its tracks. The divergence between these groups was ancient, profoundly ancient, not centuries old, not even 1 or 2 millennia old. Some of the genetic distances between Peruvian indigenous populations suggested separations that went back 8,000, 9,000, even 10,000 years. 10,000 years of separate evolutionary history within the boundaries of a single country. Think about what that means. While the Egyptians were building their first pyramids, while the first cities were appearing in Mesopotamia, While the ancestors of modern Europeans were still hunter-gatherers in the forests of Central Europe, the ancestors of a Quechua Highlander and the ancestors of an Amazonian tribal member were already genetically distinct populations, already separated by thousands of years of independent development in radically different environments. Peru is not one genetic story. It is dozens of genetic stories, all printed on top of each other, all still legible if you know how to read them. And here is where the story becomes something almost unbearable in its weight. Because those Amazonian populations, the ones with the oldest and most distinct genetic profiles, the ones whose DNA carries the deepest echoes of the original American migration, those populations are the ones under the greatest threat right now, in this century, in this decade, in this year. The Amazon is burning. You know this. Everyone knows this. But what is less discussed, what is almost never mentioned in the conversations about deforestation and climate change, is that every time an uncontacted or recently contacted Amazonian community is disrupted or destroyed, a unique genetic lineage that has existed for 10,000 years disappears with it. Not just a culture, not just a language, a biological lineage. A genetic thread that connects the living present directly to the first Americans, without interruption, without dilution, without any of the mixing or replacement that happened in the highlands and on the coast during 500 years of colonization. When these communities disappear, they take with them something that cannot be recreated by any technology that currently exists or is likely to exist. They take with them a piece of the original human journey, and it is gone forever. This is the moment in our story where the emotional temperature shifts. Because we started with mystery, with the paradox of a people whose blood tells a different story than their language. We moved through wonder, through the 15,000-year migration, through the genetic fingerprints of the first Americans, through the extraordinary survival of ancient ancestry under 5 centuries of colonial pressure. But now we arrive at something that is neither mystery nor wonder. We arrive at loss, at the specific, preventable, ongoing loss of something irreplaceable. And the question that this loss forces us to ask is not a scientific question. It is a moral one. If the DNA of these Amazonian communities is a window into the deepest layer of human history in the Americas, if it is, as one geneticist described it, the closest thing we have to a living time capsule of the original American migration, then what is the responsibility of the rest of the world toward the people who carry it? But let us not end this part of the story in darkness, because the genetic story of Peru is not primarily a story of loss. It is primarily a story of survival, extraordinary, stubborn, biologically documented survival. And nowhere is this more visible than in a phenomenon that geneticists call cultural resilience markers. The way that specific genetic variants associated with ancient Andean populations appear at dramatically higher frequencies in communities that have maintained traditional practices, traditional languages, and traditional social structures. In other words, the genetics and the culture are not separate. They are correlated. The communities that held on to Quechua, that maintained the ancient agricultural terraces, that continued the traditional textile arts, that kept the ceremonies, those communities also show the highest rates of ancient indigenous ancestry. The blood and the culture moved together. They survived together. They resisted together. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating scientific debates currently happening in Peruvian population genetics. A debate about what happened in Peru during the century between the Spanish conquest and the full establishment of the colonial system. Because the genetic data tells a story of that period that is almost impossible to comprehend in human terms. The Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. By 1572, the indigenous population of Peru had fallen by an estimated 90%. Not conquest in the traditional sense. Collapse. The complete demographic collapse of one of the most populous regions in the pre-Columbian Americas. Disease did most of the killing. Smallpox, measles, typhus, diseases for which the indigenous population had absolutely no immune preparation. In the space of 40 years, the population that had built Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman and Chan Chan and Caral, the population that had maintained continuous civilization in the Andes for 4,000 years, was reduced to a fragment of itself. And yet, the genetic evidence from the period immediately following this catastrophe shows something remarkable. The collapse did not erase the genetic diversity. It reduced it. It created bottlenecks. It changed frequencies. But the ancient ancestral signal, the deep indigenous foundation, survived even this. Even 90% mortality was not enough to break the biological thread connecting the living to the ancient dead. There is a term in population genetics for what happens to a genetic lineage that passes through a severe bottleneck and emerges on the other side. The term is genetic legacy, and Peru's genetic legacy, emerging from that catastrophic colonial era bottleneck, is a document of human resilience that has no parallel in the genetic history of any other major population on Earth. The people who survived, the 10%, the fraction of a fraction, they carried enough of the original genetic diversity to rebuild. Slowly, over generations, in the valleys and on the highlands and deep in the jungle, they rebuilt, and their descendants are alive today. 33 million of them, carrying in their cells the proof that their ancestors endured the unendurable. Now there is one more layer to this genetic story that we have not yet touched, and it is perhaps the most surprising layer of all. Because while the story of Peru's genetics is overwhelmingly a story of ancient indigenous ancestry, surviving through conquest and colonization, there is a third ancestral component that entered the Peruvian gene pool not from Europe, but from Africa. And this component, carried by the enslaved African people brought to Peru by the Spanish colonial economy to work the coastal plantations and the Lima households. This component has its own extraordinary story of survival and cultural contribution that the history books have consistently undervalued, and the genetic record refuses to ignore. The African ancestral signal in Peru is not large in percentage terms, but it is present. It is distributed in specific geographic patterns that tell you exactly where the colonial economy forced African people to live and work. And the cultural contributions of Afro-Peruvian communities, in music, in dance, in cuisine, in the specific rhythmic traditions that gave rise to the cajon, the wooden box drum that is now used in flamenco and jazz and world music globally. Those contributions are embedded in Peruvian culture so deeply that most Peruvians absorb them without knowing their origin. The cajon was born in the enslaved African communities of colonial Lima. It traveled from there to Spain through a Spanish guitarist, who visited Peru in the 1970s and brought the instrument back to Europe. And today, it is played on concert stages around the world, an African-Peruvian invention that the world adopted without knowing where it came from. This is what happens when you trace cultural objects back to their genetic origin. You find stories that nobody was telling. You find contributions that were systematically erased from the official record but survived anyway. In the music, in the food, in the rhythms of daily life, in the way a hand moves across a drum skin in a Lima neighborhood on a Saturday evening when the windows are open and the music spills out into the street and nobody asks where it came from because it has always been there, because it belongs, because belonging is not a question of official history, but of lived experience accumulated across generations. And this is the point where the genetic story and the human story finally converge into something that is larger than science and larger than history. Because what the DNA of Peru is ultimately telling us, in every haplogroup, in every ancestry percentage, in every ancient sample extracted from a 2,000-year-old coastal burial and compared to a living person in a highland village, what it is telling us is that identity is not what we were taught it was. Identity is not a flag. Identity is not a language. Identity is not a religion or a last name or the architecture of the buildings in your city center. Identity is something far older, far more stubborn, far more resistant to the violence of history than any of those things. Identity is written in a molecule so small that you need technology worth millions of dollars to read it. And when you read it, when you actually sit down with the data and follow the threads back through time, what you find is not the simple story that empires and nations and textbooks have always tried to tell. What you find is complexity. What you find is survival. What you find is the record of every single human being who ever lived and loved and suffered and endured on this specific piece of the earth, all of them still present, all of them still speaking in the only language that was never banned and never burned and never replaced. Because here is what the Spanish colonial project could not do. And this is the fact that changes everything when you truly understand it. The Spanish could rename the mountains. They did. Every major Andean peak has a Spanish name layered over an older Quechua name that the local communities never stopped using. The Spanish could demolish the temples. They did. The Temple of the Sun in Cusco, the Coricancha, was dismantled stone by stone, and a Dominican convent was built directly on top of its foundations. The Spanish could replace the calendar, ban the ceremonies, criminalize the language, impose a completely foreign religious system, and rewrite the entire historical narrative of the continent, to begin with their own arrival. They did all of this. They were thorough and they were systematic and they had 500 years to work with. But they could not reach inside the human cell. They could not open the nucleus of every indigenous Peruvian and replace what was written there. They did not have that technology, and even if they had, what they would have found inside would have defeated them. Because what is written inside the cells of the Peruvian people is 15,000 years of uninterrupted human presence on this land. 15,000 years of adaptation, of survival, of building and rebuilding, of passing something forward through every generation, no matter what happened above them in the loud surface world of politics and conquest and cultural transformation. 15,000 years is not a background. It is not a footnote. It is the entire story. Everything else is a recent addition. And now, let us talk about one individual who carries all of this history in a way that the world has noticed. Because the story of Peru's genetics would be incomplete without acknowledging that this extraordinary biological and cultural heritage has produced people of global significance whose achievements are inseparable from the specific resilience and creativity that emerges from this kind of layered, complex, survival-forged identity. Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian novelist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, once wrote that Peru is not a nation, but a problem. He meant it as a criticism. But from the perspective of genetics and deep history, it is the highest possible compliment. A problem is something complex. A problem is something that resists simple solutions and simple descriptions. A problem is something that forces you to think harder and look deeper. Peru is a problem in exactly the way that every truly interesting thing in the world is a problem. Because it contains more than it appears to contain. Because its surface does not tell you what is underneath. Because the closer you look, the more you find. And what you find refuses to be reduced to a single clean narrative. And that refusal, that biological, cultural, genetic refusal to be simplified, is Peru's greatest achievement and its greatest gift to the world. But there is one final scientific discovery that we need to address before we close this chapter of Peru's genetic story. And it is a discovery that was made only in the last few years, using the most advanced ancient DNA analysis techniques currently available. Scientists working with skeletal remains from multiple pre-Columbian Peruvian sites, remains spanning a period from 8,000 years ago to the eve of the Spanish conquest, made a discovery that challenged one of the most fundamental assumptions in South American population genetics. They had assumed, as most scientists did, that the genetic composition of Peru's indigenous populations had been relatively stable for several thousand years before European contact. That the major population movements and genetic mixings had happened in the deep past, and that by the time the Inca Empire formed, the underlying genetics had reached a kind of equilibrium. The ancient DNA said otherwise. What the ancient DNA showed was that there had been significant population replacement and genetic mixing events happening in Peru as recently as 2,000 years ago, well within what we normally call the historical period of South American civilizations. Specifically, the expansion of the Wari Empire in the 7th and 8th centuries appears in the genetic record as a clear signal of population movement and genetic admixture across the highlands. The Inca expansion in the 15th century shows a similar, if more complex, genetic signature. These were not just political and cultural expansions. They were demographic events that changed the genetic composition of the populations they touched. The Inca did not just conquer territories. They moved people. Their mita-labor system and their policy of relocating entire communities, called mitmacuna, created genetic mixing events across the length of the Andes that are still visible in the DNA of modern Andean communities today. This means that the genetic story of Peru does not have a single ancient foundation and a recent colonial disruption. It has multiple layers of foundation, each one ancient by human standards, each one deposited by a different wave of political and demographic expansion, all of them now sitting beneath the most recent colonial layer, all of them contributing to the extraordinary genetic complexity of the modern Peruvian population. It is not a simple layer cake. It is a geological formation of staggering complexity, compressed, folded, fractured by tectonic events, metamorphosed by heat and pressure, but always retaining the chemical signatures of its original components, no matter how deeply they have been buried or how violently they have been deformed. And so we arrive at the end of our genetic investigation of Peru. We started with a question: who are the Peruvian people, really, at the level of their DNA? And the answer, as you now know, is not a simple one. They are the direct biological descendants of the first Americans, the brave, freezing, impossible people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge 15,000 years ago and walked south until they found their home. They are the inheritors of 4,000 years of continuous Andean civilization that built some of the greatest architectural and agricultural achievements in human history. They are the survivors of one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in recorded history, the 90% mortality of the early colonial period, a collapse that would have destroyed the genetic legacy of a less deeply rooted population. They are the carriers of African ancestral lines brought to their country by violence and transformed by genius into cultural contributions that now belong to the entire world. And yes, they carry European ancestry too, distributed unevenly across the geography of the country, present in the coastal cities,